Well, welcome. Today we have on the show EnduroSecure Craig Bourne. We're thrilled to have Craig on. I've known you, Craig, for a long period of time since your involvement actually with our business, which we'll get to at a later stage. And but now you're kicking goals in a huge way in the specialist cybersecurity field through your own firm, EnduroSecure, as I mentioned. But welcome to the show. Let's kick it off and tell us a little bit about yourself personally, your background, where you grew up, your family, and all those sorts of things. I think they're important places to start.
Perfect. Yes, thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me. I've been in IT for probably close to 15 years or longer. Started on a help desk in 2007, another local Northern Beaches company, which is where I've lived my whole life. So Cromer and DY. Started on the help desk. A few help desk roles later, I came across to All I.T services, I think 2013, as a systems administrator, and stayed there for several years before I kind of decided, well, I've got to go ahead and specialize in something, and security was taking off at the time, and it continued to and still does to this day. But I think All I.T services was foundational in being able to easily just apply the security layer on top, because it all comes back in most cases to just good IT hygiene and foundational systems administration and networking skills, which we can talk about that. I think that's a bit of a gap, especially with a lot of the new grads coming in through that time. And other than cybersecurity and IT, I'm a musician, to be into competitive video gaming, and now now my passion and most of my hobby is actually around cybersecurity. So going to conventions, listening to podcasts, or just playing around in the lab and experimenting, learning, doing more certifications. So I was lucky enough to find something that as a career which I was really passionate in. Once I got into security by way of a cybersecurity or a network security degree, I had a few jobs working for some consulting firms, and that gave me a really good background around the cybersecurity space. That which just came kind of natural after being in the IT industry for so long. And here we are. I decided a couple of years ago to start my own firm. End of 2022, and so far so good.
Incredible. All right, let's rewind back to not necessarily just because it was with us that you kicked off, or part of your career in terms of IT, but obviously we have a portion of our business that does cybersecurity, not to the effect that what you do it, and we'll get to the intricacies of that shortly. But the foundational components of IT, in terms of what we do and what you did for us very, very well, fair to say lacking. And I think you wanted to touch on this, but we see a lot of we deal with a lot of cybersecurity consultants, and a lot of them very, very talented. But we tend to find a lot of them don't have that foundational IT knowledge, cloud, networking, all the foundational stuff that makes a business tick. Fair comment?
Very fair, and every I think part of it is that there is a cybersecurity skill shortage, which there's always headlines and articles about this, and as a consequence and as a reaction, every kind of boot camp, university, TAFE, and college is trying to pump out cybersecurity grads, and to do that within anywhere from 6 months to 3 years, you can't give them the experience they would have had at the help desk or as a systems administrator or an engineer. So you can only teach them kind of, the cybersecurity component, but if you don't have the foundational layer, you're really not going to know how to apply it. And there are, speaking to other peers in the industry of, we interviewed a security analyst who didn't know what UDP was. And it's like, well, how are you really going to be able to be an effective security practitioner without having some of that foundational knowledge? And some people are very talented, and they kind of can go straight through the cybersecurity track and be really, really effective practitioners. But I think for most people, they should probably look to start their career in a foundational, more kind of IT focused role, because that's at the end of the day, if you don't know how a network is built, how it works, and how users usually behave, and up and down the OSI model or the TCP/IP model, how you really going to know what you're either attacking or defending or consulting.
It's interesting. I know you, Craig. You've done a lot of training and training of graduates, and I'm not sure whether you still do, but maybe you can touch on that. Is it because, so obviously the practical thing, we try and find people for our business that, exactly like you, many years ago, a passion for IT, and it still is, and that's why you've been so successful. You can't really enter in any industry, but particularly this industry, where there's just so much to it without a passion. So that's the first thing. But the second thing, in terms of these, and I did a search last week in terms of just the number of courses that are available to do cybersecurity. Is it also not having the practical experience, but is it also that the courses are very, obviously they have to be cybersecurity focused, but there's not really any learnings in the practical component as well? Is that also a fair comment, or am I off track?
No, I think it's fair. So I did my degree at TAFE, New South Wales, which a lot of people aren't aware that this degree exists, but it's been around since 2012. And one of the advantages that degree has was that it is very network focused, because TAFE for decades have been a Cisco Academy partner. So they actually have all the hardware, and the first year of that degree is just CCNA and fundamental networking, which is fundamental to any type of security or IT role, just about, maybe less so for programming and coding.
Yeah.
But and that had a very big practical element to it, whereas a lot of the other boot camps or might not, and they might be too focused on, here's how you use a password cracking tool, or here's how you fire and exploit a system. There are a lot of courses, and a lot of them are getting a lot better. So I was teaching at one of those boot camps a couple of years ago, which I thought was pretty good. But they go ahead and they say, become a cybersecurity expert in 6 months. You can't become an expert on anything in 6 months. But it is a good place to start. And, I think that a lot of these courses are quite good, but you're not going to walk directly into in most cases, you're probably still going to have to start your career somewhere closer to a help desk analyst, or maybe systems administrator, which itself is a massive field and very technical, where there's a very high ceiling as well. But I always recommend to my students that they do start, if they're trying to get into the industry, don't discount just starting on a help desk. It's not as exciting maybe as what they were learning, but they're going to learn a lot more by doing that. And they'll actually be able to apply their learnings to what they're actually doing for their career. We're
finding that the scope that a standard systems administrator or help desk, it's always been fairly wide, but it's certainly getting wider and wider and wider, which I think is good for the industry, because there's more chances to and probably deviating from security, but certainly in that realm, you can dabble in some security from a practical perspective. For the likes of what we do, networking is still, I believe, the fundamental to everything in IT. If you don't have as you mentioned, the models and what have you, if you don't understand that practically and strongly, then you probably, you're going to struggle across a number of things, unless you're heading down a very specific path of things like programming and what have you. But the remit for engineers is certainly widening, and obviously you had that foundation when you were with us, and then you wandered off. Talk us through. Obviously you did the degree and all that sort of stuff. But skip a little bit ahead and talk to the first few engagements of the kind of work you were doing, because I know you were doing some work for some pretty big names, and obviously you don't need to mention names or organisations, because again, a lot of what we talk about is highly confidential, and some of the breaches are kept under wraps and all that sort of stuff. But you were working for and with some pretty big names. Talk us about some of that work, and I know you've got some interesting war stories there.
Yeah, so my first security focused role uh, after All I.T, and even during All I.T, we did see some of the very early ransomware back in 2014 or 15,
Correct.
where it
Yeah.
was kind of like, what is this? And hold on a second, we have to go and buy Bitcoin to, you know, if we want to get our files back. And to see that evolve into, the kind of organised crime or the nation state stuff has been really interesting, in the space of 10 years, where that's now a multi-billion-dollar industry. So, even back doing in, my days with All I.T was kind of where I probably got my interest in some of the cybersecurity stuff as well. My
Yeah.
first security focused role at a firm called Secure Logic, smaller kind of managed security services provider, had a lot of state government customers. And the good thing about that role was there was, and any kind of managed service role or consulting role where you have lots of different customers, is the scope of the different engagements and assignments that you'll be doing on, that you'll be working on. So I was doing a lot of security operations work, so building a security operations capability, so monitoring and detection. Usually that's using tools like SIEM, security and information event management systems, similar to Splunk, and now you've got Sentinel and others. So learning how to architect that and then develop detection rules to try and filter out through all of the logs what suspicious or malicious activity would be. We're also doing a bit of penetration testing, which is ethical hacking into a system to see if there are any weaknesses that need to be shored up. Vulnerability management and assessment, and what else were we doing? We're really doing a little bit of everything, security operations-wise, vulnerability management as well, and also threat hunting, which is kind of more of a proactive engagement rather than a reactive engagement. So that's where you're kind of going into your network with some hypotheses and you're trying to prove them true or false. And when I went to Accenture, which was the next place I landed, again, massive firm, the clients were a lot bigger. So working again in security operations centers, and then at one point I was deployed in Macau for 3 weeks to do a threat hunt at a large casino over there. We worked on some of the biggest incident response engagements in APAC, some really large scale compromise and rebuilding of entire kind of Fortune 500 company networks.
Mm-hmm.
What else? We were doing a security assessment on a wireless blasting detonator, which is used in mine sites in Australia and across the world. So I was kind of looking at more of the supply chain and how could this potentially be tampered with, risk assessment on the entire end-to-end solution, the access control, and the physical components of like the radio and the of the detonator itself. So
Wow.
Accenture was a great place to be just because of the types of opportunities you get there. You don't get outside of a big four consulting firm or some of the really other large security
Yeah.
providers. Also, and all of that is what gave me the confidence to go and start EnduroSecure after kind of being there, those other companies for a few years.
Interesting. Just on Craig, that in terms of the big four, and obviously you were in regards to that. I had noticed from our perspective too, and it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. When the likes of the Optuses and the Medibanks and these big cybersecurity events that occurred and affected people, I think prior to those, people were organisations were hacked, and a lot of the times it was kept very silent because legislation in Australia didn't require people to necessarily sort of sing from the rooftops and say or notify people that they've been hacked. But obviously, and it continues to evolve, which we might touch on as well. But those few were certainly big, and it affected people because their identities were leaked. They had details that were driver's licenses need to be changed and all that sort of stuff. I feel that, because obviously we're in it all day, every day in the IT field, and talking to people and just seeing what people's reactions were, I think that caused a shift from, and maybe this was, due to the fact that you've created your organisation, but a lot of organisations, maybe not in the big organisations, but in the medium and the small businesses, went from being that'll never happen to us to hearing more about it to going, okay, well, we actually need to be a little bit more. We need to put some preventative measures. We need to have a plan, all that sort of stuff. Do you feel that those big cases? I mean, it's terrible to say this, but aided in that. I often say to people, I think those things needed to occur to put this on the map, because lots of it is happening out there that people just didn't know about. And still to this day, I mean, there's a huge amount of security breaches and things occurring in the small to medium space. And if you're a small business, for example, or a medium-sized business, and you get hacked, you don't sort of blast it out on your socials that you've been hacked and what have you. It's not sort of the most enlightening thing you want to tell your client base or your suppliers. Did you sort of see that shift? I mean, it's obviously been quite a few years now since the bigger players have been done, but is that a fair assumption that it has changed the narrative?
It is, and it's what kind of brought it out into the mainstream. In Australia, we had, I think, Medibank, Optus, and Latitude within the space of a few
That's
months.
right, yeah.
Some people were caught up in all three, and that's not uncommon, because all of those are very big providers of various services, and all of those are big companies. But I think the what kind of got some of the smaller businesses to take notice was all of the talk of potential fines, ranging into millions of dollars. There were CEOs who got sacked. There was a lot of publicity. The then Minister for Cybersecurity was making a lot of noise about it, Claire O'Neill, and basically accusing more or less some of these companies of being of not having good cyber hygiene and of being reckless, rather than kind of making excuses for them. And I think that kind of showed that, hold on, this is something that I'm responsible for as a company director. And if and it's not about victim blaming, because it's not your fault if you get breached. But if you don't have good cyber hygiene, people aren't, and you do get breached, people aren't going to be kind of going after and being upset with the threat actors. They're going to be upset with the people they trust to hold on to their, to take custody of their data, or maybe to not have their data anymore because it was so old that there was no need for it to be retained that long. And a lot of the case, that's kind of what makes these things a lot worse, is all the historical data which shouldn't have been there in the first place. And you look at, there was a more recent one called EnduroSecure, who were providing e-prescriptions for the state or for the Commonwealth. After they had it breached, their company was wound up and they've been liquidated. So they have very real impact, and it can wind down a company if you're not going to be able to afford to pay for the response, whether it's paying the ransom, whether it's paying for getting the firm, or even if it's just the impending lawsuits that you're expecting to happen, because there are class action lawsuits against some of those names we spoke about before.
Yeah. And I do quite a bit of board consulting, particularly for non-for-profits, but for some other boards that, in the intermediary space, in terms of size of company. It's still interesting, Craig, that the board level of education around cybersecurity is still very low. And look, boards have a huge responsibility on finances, on under the Corporations Act that is all encompassing, and it's quite big. But still, education in the space, and that's the reason why I talk to a lot of boards is to lift that level of education, just from a risk perspective. And there is changes already at foot in regards to the Corporations Act, in regards to the Privacy Act. So it's only going one way. Talk us through some of what you know in regards to the Privacy Act and the Corporations Act and the responsibility directors have in regards to security, because it's changing. The federal government, I know there's been a change in minister recently, but it still has a huge huge focus from a government perspective, and I know there's some things coming out there. So, firstly, you're still finding that education in this area is still low from a board perspective, and secondly, what are some of the risks?
I think the education is getting better based on what we just spoke about, but the main thing that I think that directors need to come to terms with is that cybersecurity should no longer be seen as an IT issue, because if you see them as an IT issue, and then you've got All I.T doing your IT, you're going to think that All I.T are doing all of your security. Now, All I.T will be doing a lot of your security, especially around best practice and hygiene and probably patch management, vulnerability management, but they're not going to be, for example, coming up with a cybersecurity strategy or driving that culture within their organisation. Your IT company can't do that, or your IT team can't do that, because this needs to be driven from the very, very top. They can't decide whether or not you're going to pay a ransom or how you're going to negotiate with threat actors. They can't decide whether you're going to notify the OAIC that you had a potential information breach. So that needs to be, I think, the first bit of education. Cybersecurity should be spoken about at those meetings. It doesn't need to be the whole focus, but it should be a topic, because it is a business risk and not an IT issue. There are some information security or cybersecurity issues that might not really have much to do with technology at all as well. So that's the first thing. As far as the legislation is evolving, we recently had the Security of Critical Infrastructure Bill came in. Designated what critical infrastructure means. So I think during COVID, we understood that, hold on, critical infrastructure isn't just our pipelines and our electricity, but it's also our education, it's hospitals, it's food and groceries. And as a consequence of that, there's obligations and mandatory obligations as far as reporting and hygiene and how you're able to, your business resilience against responding to a cybersecurity incident, to the point where the Commonwealth now have step-in powers where they can come and actually take over a lot of your business operations and IT operations if they don't believe that you are going to be able to respond to a breach you've just had. So a lot of the mandatory notifications as well for if you have an incident in certain industries, especially government organisations, disclosing that you've had a data breach, that you've got the mandatory data breach notification scheme. At the federal level, there's also state level obligations that you might have. And we've also got a draft, I believe, of the cybersecurity bill, which is incoming probably shortly as well, which I haven't read in detail, but I think that's also going to address a lot of obligations that you have as a board or a company director. There's a lot of things happening in that space, very fast moving. I think that that's been given a real accelerator due to some of those large-scale breaches, and having the cybersecurity ministers be very public about all of this, and with all the promises that have kind of been made, and a lot of the kind of outcry and demand, I think, from the population is driving a lot of that.
Talk us through. I know that another area of focus is the preventative measure of what organisations can do. So, there's so many components to this, but one of where I'm leading to is around cyber insurance. Another push, not only on the legislative side, that we're seeing organisations having to move in this area, and unfortunately, we're seeing both the cybersecurity and the legislative areas forcing companies to make plans, to put in preventative measures, to have a plan, all those sorts of things, which I think is good. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to lean on legislation in order to lift the standards, and in this case it is, because we've been sort of, and you would imagine too, have been barking up the tree of a lot of organisations saying you've got to do this, you've got to do X, Y, and Z, and not getting a hell of a lot of response, and then something happens, and then all of a sudden, there's an overreaction. We see that a lot, but also in regards to the cybersecurity insurance area, because that's being now pushed. What we're noticing, a small portion of organisations taking out a policy because they want coverage, because they do hold personal identifiable information, or they've got a big business continuity risk if a cyber event occurs. But similarly, we're also the biggest trend we're seeing in cyber insurance, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts, is if you're an organisation and you're demanded by your suppliers, if you are dealing with government organisations or you're dealing with other bigger suppliers, multinationals that require you to have insurances in place. And if you do have insurances in place, you've got to meet a minimum standard. Either you won't even get insurance, or the policy's just through the roof. Talk us what you're seeing in that area, which I think is another big push.
Well, I think the insurers probably 5 years ago thought cybersecurity policies, that's easy money, right? What even is cybersecurity insurance? And then they started having to pay for either ransom payments or the cleanup and the response to an incident. And then they kind of pushed back a little bit and said, okay, well, if we're going to give you a policy, you're going to have to demonstrate that you have at least some level of cybersecurity maturity and resilience. You might have to have these controls in place before we're going to give you a policy. So it's a lot harder, I think, now to get policies. I think that the industry is a lot more risk averse now to just deal them out, just because of the uptick in ransomware and other and business email compromise and other wire fraud types of attacks. Now, I think you should definitely go for a policy. I'm a security company. I have a cybersecurity policy myself, but it's obviously that's kind of like a recovery control. It's only part of it. It would be the wrong approach to say, okay, we're just going to get a cybersecurity policy, because while they may be able to pay for, you can transfer some of that risk, that financial risk of having to pay for an incident response team or to rebuild your systems. But you can't transfer that reputational risk to anyone. That's yours to keep. Your customers don't really probably care too much whether you have a cybersecurity policy. That's just kind of to get you to keep the lights on for yourself. So just make sure, I suppose, that it's just part of your overall cybersecurity defense and strategy. I think it's a good thing that the insurers as well are now a bit more kind of shy about just giving out policies, and I think a lot of cybersecurity uplift is driven by being able to get a security policy, insurance policy. So that probably has that kind of indirect way of uplifting some organisations if they weren't going to do it otherwise. But certainly, defence in depth will suggest that you start with your deterrent controls and your preventative controls and your detective, and then your recovery. And insurance is mostly a recovery control.
It's interesting that it's forced some people, but I often, also talk to people and say that, and you mentioned that the whole idea of reputational risk is something that, is massive. Another area that I find, before we move on to some of the gory, scary stories, which I'm sure you've got a few, Craig, that one of the other things that I think is important for organisations is not only your cybersecurity, but and maybe this is certainly applies to us, but we're doing a lot of consulting around. Okay, well, you're taking on board SaaS platforms or third-party platforms that you're utilising to run your businesses or provide services to your organisation, but there's an inherent risk that you're taking on from their cybersecurity. So you also we're advising people to say, look at not only your cybersecurity, but the cybersecurity of particularly where you're passing on customer information. I'll give you an example. In the hospitality industry, there was a breach last year. It might have been earlier this year. Luckily, none of our clients were affected, but could easily happen. There wasn't a number of pubs and clubs throughout New South Wales and Australia where you were coming into the organisation to do, check in. You give your identity, and then all of a sudden, the organisation's providing those details to a third party, and that third party's been breached. So what we're saying is, it's not only your cybersecurity, but do your checks and balances of where you're providing customer information, where you're doing things like that. So it runs deeper than just your organisation, Craig, doesn't it? And you do
Yeah.
have to do your due diligence.
And what you're describing is supply chain risk, which is a very hot topic right now. I think what you're referring to is that maybe it was a Clubs New South Wales breach where there was scanned information was sent over to the UK. They were outsourcing to the Philippines. The Philippines weren't being paid for their work. I might be don't fact
Yeah,
check
it's
any of
about
this. And
it's about that. Correct. It wasn't
something
necessarily
similar.
malicious, but it was internal to those
Well,
organisations.
yeah, and that's like 3 steps away from your organisation at the hospitality venue. And this is a very big challenge. I'm doing a lot of work with state government right now, one department who has thousands of suppliers, and most of what we're responding to nowadays is not anything to do with our network. It's to do with suppliers of that organisation and they've had a breach. And then the question is, well, um, if we provide data to a third party and that data is subsequently breached, is it our supply chain? Is it our security incident or is it their security incident?
Yeah.
Or more importantly, does it even matter? Because the net result is that you're the face as far as your customers are concerned. And if they've never heard of these third parties, they usually haven't, then I think
No.
they'd probably be more upset. And I think you're probably going to wear the brunt of it.
Correct.
It's you see a lot of these press releases after an incident, and they usually happen on a Friday afternoon where they hope it kind of goes away over the weekend. But usually you'll see, we take your security seriously. It was one of our providers, and they try and shift that blame pretty quickly. I don't know how effective that is, because if you try and point us to someone we've never heard of before as a consumer, I don't think that's really going to do a whole lot
No.
to
And the consumer provided
satisfy them.
that organisation with their details.
Yeah, and that's just the way the world works now. And I think everyone understands that a lot of things are done by cloud processors or data brokers or other places to make things more affordable or whichever. The reality is you do need to be doing due diligence. What you can do and what you should be doing is an assessment or a questionnaire, or even just having a conversation with your providers and just asking them questions. Do you have cyber insurance? Do you have an incident response plan? Do you get penetration tests? Now, if these are smaller providers, they might give you these answers. And there's no reason, by the way, if they ever come back and say we can't tell you that for security reasons, I'd take that as a red flag. None of these questions are that they shouldn't be able to answer, and they should be able to answer them pretty quickly. Other things, do you have any certifications? Do you you could even ask them, what is your biggest security incident you've ever had and how did you respond to it? Now, if you're dealing with a larger provider like Microsoft or Google, you're not going to get that type of information from them. But they will publish some things to do with their position and their security maturity, whether it's through like an IRAP assessment report or other certifications they may have. But you really need to, and I think small businesses especially, because small businesses, gone are the days where they were hosting their own information in on a server under the desk. It's all kind of cloud now, or if you're an accounting firm, you probably don't have, fixed client software running that. It's probably using Xero or NYOB or something online. And you might say, okay, well, we don't really need to worry about the security of all of that. Now tell me, what if Xero went down, or what if Xero had a breach? Would you just be able to go to your customers and say, well, we use Xero, so there's nothing we could have done? And maybe that's true, but did you do anything? Did you actually ever check whether Xero had high availability for their data, or if they were recently acquired by maybe another country, and now their data is at risk? And if the answer is no, then can you really say that you were doing everything that you could do? So
exactly. I'll give you a good example, Craig.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is Microsoft 365 probably deviating a little bit from the sub? Oh, it's not really, but the situation with Microsoft 365, and everyone uses, large portions use it, and Google for that matter. They're using SharePoint, they're using OneDrive, they're using email. That data is not backed up. They don't back the data up. They provide high uptime, they provide all these things, but the data's not backed up. And it's amazing that people don't know this. And we take on clients. We're taking on a number of clients at the moment that have never been notified of this before. And, I always say to them, well, yes, Microsoft have huge amounts of resiliency and redundancy and all those sorts of things, but it's not necessarily that you've got to be wondering. It's similarly to the internal threat actors. Do you have plans in place for a malicious employee that deletes data, goes beyond the 14, 30-day retention period, and the data's lost, or consistently deleting information? All these sorts of things. So you've got to think about these things. And you've got to, for some people, it's a cost thing. So you've got to do a risk analysis, whether I do want to back this data up. But you've got to be, I think, coming back to your point, you've got to be asking the question, right? Or the questions.
Well, you need to make it, and if you're providing it to an end customer, definitely you need to be providing that context and giving them the option. Internally as well, a risk assessment should, during discovery, should find this out. So if this is, something that you need availability of your emails, then if you're not during your risk assessment, that should be one of the risk statements. Emails not available, or emails have been deleted, and then when you go through your risk management, then that control should be applied. Okay, we'll go ahead and put backups on it. So that's a really good way to understand a lot of that, especially that kind of second, third party risk. During a risk assessment or risk management exercise. As I said, most of the incidents that we're responding to at a large state government department are all to do with supply chain. Not necessarily anything to do with us, but whether they process our data, they store our data, or they have access into the systems there. And if you don't have anything contractually obligating them to let you know, we're the first people because way too often we're finding this out from press releases or news or the media contacting us and saying, hey, what are you doing about this breach? Does it affect you? Which is not the way you want to find out about something. No. So another control you can put in place is to, if you're going to engage a supplier, whether they're your IT provider or your hosting provider or someone you're shipping off your backups to, is if you do have an issue, any type of incident, how are you going to respond to it? How are you going to inform us? And make sure that's in the contract, such that even if they don't, it still covers you, because you can, again, your end customers are going to be more upset with yourself, but at least you can point to, this is everything that we've put in place to make sure this doesn't happen. And all you can do at the end of the day is your due diligence and make sure you've got controls in. You'll always have residual risk, but usually that residual risk can be accepted given enough controls.
Interesting. Let's change it up a little bit and talk to some of the work you're doing for clients, and I suppose that'll sort of paint a picture of what you do at EnduroSecure. Are you, obviously there's a number of streams you're looking at, post-incident, you're looking at preventative measures, you're looking at, risk assessments, all that sort of stuff. Have I hit the nail on the head, or am I missing things? What are the big areas that you look at as an organisation when you're tasked with a project of sorts?
Yeah, it is the entire spectrum from penetration testing of companies to they've had an incident, now they need to do some forensics or some response and recovery. A lot of work these days is especially around ISO 27001 preparedness or IRAP preparedness, because they might need this certification for required contractually by their customers or their clients. And there's also other things like vulnerability management and security awareness, phishing tests, and Essential 8 implementation. So really the full spectrum. I think that what a lot more organisations now are looking for is things like the Essential 8, because it's just a good place to start. A lot of, especially smaller companies, will say, where do we really start? And Essential 8 from a technical view is a pretty good place to start. Most breaches would be prevented, or incidents would be prevented, just by having multi-factor authentication. We keep saying it, have it changed in in decades now. But it's still surprising how many people aren't putting it, or they are, but just not on everything. And you only need one account to. There's a saying that you need to be right 100% of the time, and the threat actor only needs to be right one time. So you really need to understand your entire attack surface, and that includes all of the shadow IT and all of the forgotten legacy stuff where you could be intruded through. So bit of everything.
Craig, where you've and what you're doing now and in the past, and I suppose this applies to situations that have occurred, bad situations, and to the penetration testing, and maybe talk us about what, because some of these people that are listening are not aware of what penetration testing is. But in both cases, are a lot of these and it can be big for a small organisation, or it can be big in terms of a lot of people are exposed and it's a bigger organisation. But do a lot of them start from some of these more simple areas, like multi-factor on certain accounts, and just I was reading something in the States in one of the critical infrastructure leaks, and again, for people that don't know IT, but an open port to a typical port, so the internet works off ports, really simplistically. Communicating back and forth and having open ports on infrastructure is a bad thing. So let's just probably, without going down the rabbit hole of what an open port is, but that was, this sort of stuff should have been closed up years ago, open port, and they got breached. So my question to you is it still a lot of this, what we would think is basic stuff, but the basics are still not being done?
Yeah, it's usually not even open ports that shouldn't be open, but it's probably nowadays more a zero-day vulnerability has just been discovered, or a proof of concept exploit for a vulnerability has just been discovered, and now within hours now, threat actors are scanning the entire internet to exploit these, because they know that a lot of larger organizations at least have a 48-hour window for critical vulnerabilities. If you have a vulnerability management program and a patch management program and a dedicated team, you can sometimes push a change through within that amount of time. The threat actors know this, and that's why as soon as a new vulnerability or a new exploit is available, they're scanning the entire internet and they're exploiting these. And then once they get in, then they're putting their persistence backdoor in. They might even patch the vulnerability themselves so that you're none the wiser that it was ever vulnerable in the first place. That is one of the a lot of the high profile incidents are just due to the threat actors just being quicker in reacting to that. The other one, it still continues to be phishing. Again, you only need one person to click an email and download something to get you remote access to that system, or to provide you their password or something to get into that system, and from there you can usually move laterally and achieve your objective. You really need to get the basics right, which I think is why the Essential 8 is a really good model. And by the way, it's no substitute for having a security strategy, a security policy, and buy-in from senior management. Again, security should not be just considered as an IT issue, but as a business priority. But the Essential 8 is a great place to start, because it does look at things like just patching operating systems and good backup strategies. What else is there? Microsoft Office macros, which is another big one, where people are getting in trouble by trusting Word documents which are sent to them.
It's a good place to start. I mean, our entire model is based off two strategies: the Essential 8 and the CIS controls, which is we won't get into too much of the technical, but out of the United States. Talk us through some of the more intricate work you do in terms of. So, I think just before we move on to recap, it's you don't need to spend, for the average organisation. I say this a lot. You can get from a very average, what I would say average standard, to a much better standard, or what I would say probably a decent standard. I know that's a little bit ambiguous, but without spending huge amounts of dollars. Yes, you do have to spend some dollars, like implementation is going to cost you some money, but working to a standard, and again, as you say, it's probably the most important thing is having the buy-in from all sides of the organisation. But getting from that decent standard to the, having what is deemed maximum protection, and obviously you can never guarantee any sorts of things, but talk us through some of the things that you're doing for organisations and for government and what have you in terms of that next level of of protection. This detailed penetration testing, and I know a big thing in your game is vulnerability scanning constantly and all this sort of stuff. Talk us through some of that intricate work you do.
Yeah, so penetration testing is more, I describe it as security assurance, because it's not, you're not really ready to do a penetration test until you have some level of maturity. Because if you have no level of maturity, you know, the money's probably better spent on doing some uplift first, and building some resilience, building some maturity. Once you do have some security controls in place, penetration test is all about trying to identify any gaps. And it's different to vulnerability management, which we can talk about, because with penetration testing, you're just trying to find one way to achieve the objective. It might be to get a domain administrator access, it might be to get some sensitive files, it might be to deploy some, pretend, malware that could compromise the network. And usually, there's a scope. That scope might be narrowed if it's a very specific system that you're trying to test, or it might just be very broad. If there's any way you can, get into the organization. And sometimes it's even called red teaming, which is where you can even, do social engineering or phishing, or, wear a fake moustache and walk in with a ladder and flip forward through the front door and see if you can get in that way. And usually, in these, we'll always have findings and recommendations, and that's always the point. It's not to kind of show off how much, how good a computer hacker you are or anything like that. It is all about finding things that the customer actually cares about, and they don't always care about every single find. You might say, well, we're able to exploit this system and run our own arbitrary code on it, but then they might say, yeah, but that just powers the vending machine in the lobby, which is fair enough, and they might just be willing to accept that risk. But if you do find high risks that they actually want to shore up, then that's what it's all about, providing those recommendations. Other work, and just because there's sometimes a bit of confusion, vulnerability management is similar, but it's usually an operational work. In other words, it's ongoing. You can't just run a vulnerability scan once a year. As we just said, vulnerabilities get exploited usually quicker than you can patch them. So you do need to have a vulnerability management program doing ongoing scanning. Then you need to hook that into your change management and your patch management processes. Make sure there's a very streamlined way of approaching patch mitigation and vulnerability mitigation. And sometimes you also have a situation where the vulnerability was just announced, but the patch hasn't, or the workaround hasn't. And then you need to decide, well, do we put some compensating controls in? Do we just shut that system offline very quickly and wait, until we can get it patched and secured? Other work that we do is something called threat hunting. Again, this is where it's kind of an assumed breach engagement. And the reason that's important is because, again, it's security assurance, but you've got all these controls in place. But the dwell time for some threat actors is upwards of months or years, where they can be within your network before announcing themselves through ransomware. Or if they're, some threat actors aren't about disruption or ransom at all. It might just be espionage, in which case they can be very quiet for a long time. So using threat intelligence, you can kind of understand, well, who are the threat actors and what are they doing? Are they interested in my industry? Are they interested in my vertical? Are they interested in my region? And if they are, well, maybe I should assume they're in there. And that way it kind of flips around the mindset. So now you're trying to prove they're not in there rather than just react when you think they are in there. It means that you're going to get a lot higher level of assurance after you do it. Again, you're not going to find everything, but you are doing everything you can to try and secure your network and make sure it's there. Incident response can be very, very involved. Sometimes you get down to forensic acquisition of a system or a server. Incident response is about a few things. One is getting back to BAU. It's also about the kind of runs in parallel with your disaster recovery and business continuity to try and evict the threat actor. It's also about establishing root cause and lessons learned at the end. So if someone was able to get in, it might not always be obvious as to how until you've spent a lot of time doing some analysis.
Right. So talk us through another common, I know the basics of what I'm about to ask you, but most people say to me, why does all this occur in terms of the bad stuff? And it's not obvious to a lot of people. So obviously there's an entire underworld market, I suppose, for want of a better term, of, primarily in one area, financial gain, but as you said, espionage, and there's a lot that's happening with in Eastern Europe and all these sorts of things. Talk us through some of that dynamics, because I know that some hackers hack to then on-sell to other parts of the underworld and, the black market and all this sort of stuff. Talk us through that, because it's a weird world. And, before you answer that, there's a lot of medium-sized, obviously big organisations, they've got big bounties, they've been hacked. Some of them have been paid, so they know there's a payday of some kind to someone through some method. But in smaller and medium-sized organisations, a lot of people say to me, well, why? And then the next question generally is, well, I wouldn't be of any use to them, and I'd be, and it's surprising, interestingly, that's where there is money, because one, they're easier to hack because they haven't put all the things that you've been talking about in place. Two, they have personal personal information that is worth a lot of money, and it's worth something to someone. So if the time taken to hack someone is low, but the subset of information is not massive because it's deemed not to be big, it's still worth decent money. Talk us through all of that. I know that's a long question, but
no,
that's the primary reason, right?
So if you go back in time far enough, a lot of hacking was done mainly for experimentation and kind of notoriety, and just because there weren't really any laws against it. And then over time, as more things started to get connected, you did start to see an element of crime. And in earlier days, it was things like credit card numbers, and they called it carding. Just getting POS terminal, selling cards, testing cards, see if they work, and just selling them to other people for various purposes. As time went on, and maybe fast forwarding a bit to 2009, it's probably the one of the earliest examples of espionage and disruption at a nation-state level. We're talking about Stuxnet, which is commonly attributed to Israel and the United States against the Iranian nuclear program, which by all reports seems to be somewhat effective in disrupting that. So that was more of a state, one of the earlier examples of state-sponsored, and it happens on all sides, not just, Western and democracies are hacking too. If you go into things that are happening out of North Korea, well, there's so many sanctions against North Korea. They're actually hacking for financial gain more than anything, and also some espionage because they're trying to, gain access to blueprints and schematics of weaponry. They're trying to make a nuclear program, which is very hard to do when you're an isolated country. Of course, you've got the ransomware operators in a lot of Eastern Europe, where it's usually more financial gain, maybe not state-sponsored, but certainly state-tolerated. Whereas as long as you're not attacking the motherland, they usually leave you alone, especially if you're attacking the right targets. A lot of the stuff that comes out of Asia is more about the identity theft and pig butchering scams. So usually what you touched on, lower level targets like romance scams and Nigerian prince, where it's kind of like, let's just try and drain someone's bank account. It's kind of low risk and moderate reward. It's not always very effective. You have to have entire call centers of people, and you might get a few. Yeah. And as you said, they might not have the most amount of money, but it's a much wider attack surface, and it's very cheap to run, especially out of the various places where it runs in third world countries. And you've also got you know places where it's more about kind of espionage. So rather than any type of disruption, it might just be about learning state secrets or trade secrets. If you're trying to compete with other countries or other regions of the world, you just try to keep an ear to the ground and see what's going on in there. So the entire spectrum, I suppose, of reasons for it, motivations are different. Understanding those motivations is important to understanding what you might be up against in your industry, in your department, in your area of the world. We usually call that threat intelligence. It's understanding who are the actors and what are they doing and why. And based on that, a threat intelligence informed cybersecurity posture is really important to making sure you're investing in the right places. Because otherwise, that there's so much money you could be spending. You could spend your entire budget just on security controls. But another thing that's important to probably call out here is there is such thing as too much security. Security rarely makes things easier. It usually applies friction. You wouldn't have a $500 phone case on a $100 phone, for example. So it's all about risk. What are you willing to accept? If we don't think this particular threat actor is going to try and target us in this manner, then maybe we don't need to spend a lot of our resources in preparing for that.
Interesting. But let's obviously, you've kicked off with how long have you been going with EnduroSecure now? It's certainly been a number of years, from what I understand.
Oh, I think it's nearly been probably nearly 3 years.
Yeah, it's come along really well. Talk us through some of what's the typical engagement look like for a client, and some examples of that.
Luckily, there's no typical engagement, but usually what I find is very small customers are usually after things like phishing simulations, penetration tests against smaller networks, or just incident response, because usually with smaller organizations you're only hearing from them if something's happened, and those can usually be done within a few weeks. To larger organizations, especially when they're engaging myself, it's usually for something like an IRAP assessor, because there's only so many IRAP assessors that you can engage, and that might be a 6 months plus long engagement where it's all about implementing maybe hundreds and hundreds of controls, validating that they're working, getting them ready for the actual assessor who's going to be measuring them against all of those controls. Similar with ISO 27001, which is a long journey and it's an ongoing journey. It's not just a matter of implementing all of the controls.
Sort of tick box exercise.
Recertification. It's testing and validation. It's introducing the culture and the steering committee to drive that and drive that forward in perpetuity. So not really any type of it's always different, which I think is probably one of the things that I like about consulting, because every customer is very different, every engagement is very different. Yeah.
Awesome, mate. We could talk a long time about all this stuff. It's fascinating in whether you're in the cybersecurity or you're looking to get into it, or you're a client or a potential client that's needing services. It's there's we sort of even touch the very surface of all of this. But how can people contact you? Where are you located? I'm presuming you're doing work across the country, so it's not really about a location anymore. Each time I chat with you, you're in Melbourne or you're in Canberra or what have you, so you're all over the place. But how can people get in contact with you, Craig?
Yeah, sure. You can find me on LinkedIn, Craig Bourne. You can also find my website, nsec.au or EnduroSecure.com. Love to chat about cybersecurity. So reach out.
Yeah, reach out. Obviously, you've been a great success. Obviously, a great sounding board to us over the years, and we're proud of the fact that you in some way, shape, or form kicked off your career, your IT career rather, with us, and it's been great to see you flourish in this very specialised area. And if you need those services, don't hesitate to reach out to Craig. Mate, thanks for coming on board, on to chat rather, and hopefully we'll have you back on to maybe talk about some specific breaches and things. I mean, I have a feeling that this is only just starting, particularly from that sort of the media generated type stuff. So it'll be good to have you on from time to time to talk about those and what it means and why and all those sorts of things, because it's, I mean, I hope they don't, but from what we see about the place, when we take on clients, as I said, we're taking on a number of clients at the moment, and we just see that the cyber posture, what we reference to as the cyber posture, and we're doing, the essentials component, I suppose, is of the essential 8, and then you're doing all that specialist work and assessments and all the stuff that you said. But the posture is got a long way to go, and I think with that said, we're going to see a lot more of this activity, and not only if the posture significantly increased across the spectrum of business in Australia. That doesn't negate the need for constant monitoring and a constant plan, because, as you say, zero-day vulnerabilities can occur like that, and they do. We see them all the time. They're a daily occurrence. So reach out to Craig. If you need Craig's details, feel free to reach out to me. And again, Craig, thanks for coming on board, and hope to have you on again soon.
Perfect. Thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Good on you. Thanks, mate.